Europe, a continent perpetually reshaped by the currents of history, found itself in an unprecedented state of upheaval. The echoes of the French Revolution, a cataclysmic event that had shattered the Ancien Regime and sent shockwaves through every royal court, still reverberated across its ancient lands. Monarchies trembled, aristocracies scattered, and the very concept of divine right was challenged by the raw, untamed force of popular sovereignty. It was a time of profound instability, a volatile crucible where old orders crumbled and new, terrifying possibilities emerged from the ashes. In this tumultuous landscape, where the scent of gunpowder mingled with the heady perfume of radical ideals, a figure of extraordinary ambition and brilliance began to ascend. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery officer barely in his 20s, yet already possessed of a mind that moved with the precision of a finely tuned clockwork and the audacity of a predator. Born on the rugged, windswept island of Corsica, a land fiercely proud of its independence, his humble origins instilled in him a burning desire for recognition, a relentless drive to prove himself worthy of a world that had initially offered him little. The insular nature of his upbringing, coupled with the scorn often directed at those from the periphery of French society, forged an unshakable resolve within him. He saw the chaos not as an obstacle, but as an unparalleled opportunity, a canvas upon which he could paint his own destiny. His early military career, though modest in rank, quickly distinguished him. The siege of Toulon in 1793 served as his inaugural stage, a grim yet pivotal moment where his tactical genius shone with blinding clarity. The city, a key naval base, was held by royalist forces supported by British and Spanish fleets, presenting a formidable challenge. While older, more established commanders dithered, Napoleon, then a mere captain, devised a daring plan to capture the strategic heights overlooking the harbor, from which his artillery could bombard the enemy ships. His proposal, initially met with skepticism, proved devastatingly effective. The swift, decisive victory not only secured Toulon for the Republic, but also earned him a rapid promotion to brigadier general, a testament to his burgeoning reputation. He was no longer just a Corsican outsider. He was a rising star, a man who understood the language of cannon and strategy better than any other. Yet, even as Napoleon's star ascended, the French Directory government, which had replaced the radical excesses of the Reign of Terror, found itself mired in political instability and corruption. Weak, indecisive, and constantly battling internal factions, the Directory struggled to maintain control, its authority eroded by economic hardship and lingering royalist threats. This vacuum of power, however, only amplified Napoleon's growing influence within the army. Soldiers, disillusioned by the political maneuvering and the perceived incompetence of their civilian leaders, looked to men like Bonaparte, who offered clarity, discipline, and, most importantly, victory. His name became synonymous with success, a beacon of hope in an otherwise chaotic national landscape. A sense of destiny, almost preordained, began to cling to him like a shadow. He moved through the opulence and intrigue of revolutionary Paris, observing, calculating, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The stage was being meticulously set for a meteoric rise, a journey that would redefine Europe itself. He cultivated early personal relationships with influential figures, understanding that power was not only won on the battlefield, but also forged in the salons and back rooms of the capital. These connections, often born of shared ambition or mutual benefit, provided him with crucial intelligence and support, further fueling his relentless ascent. Even then, the first whispers of a grander vision for France and for himself began to form in his mind. He saw a nation yearning for order, for glory, for a leader who could transcend the petty squabbles of politicians. He believed he was that leader. The undercurrents of betrayal and opportunity were palpable in Parisian society, a constant dance between loyalty and self-interest. Napoleon, with his keen intellect, was a master at navigating these treacherous waters, always calculating his next move, always anticipating the shifting allegiances. His strategic mind was not confined to military maneuvers. It extended to the intricate chessboard of politics, where every move had consequences and every weakness could be exploited. This was the initial spark of his legendary self-belief, an unshakable conviction in his own capabilities that would propel him to unimaginable heights. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The Directory, recognizing Napoleon Bonaparte's undeniable military prowess, but wary of his burgeoning popularity, sought to distance him from the political heart of France. Their solution was a command they believed would occupy him, perhaps even humble him: the impoverished army of Italy. This force, neglected and undersupplied, was tasked with confronting the formidable Austrian and Sardinian armies. To many, it was a poisoned chalice, an assignment designed to fail. Yet for Napoleon, it was another canvas, another opportunity for his genius to manifest. He arrived in Italy to find a demoralized ragtag army, but he saw not weakness, but potential. He spoke to them not of hardship, but of glory, of rich plains to be conquered, and of the fame that awaited them. What followed was a campaign that would etch his name into the annals of military history. Napoleon, discarding conventional strategies, embraced speed, deception, and overwhelming force. His troops, inspired by his charismatic leadership and promise of plunder, moved with astonishing rapidity, often outmaneuvering and outflanking their more numerous but slower adversaries. He struck with surgical precision, dividing and conquering the Sardinian and Austrian forces in a series of breathtaking engagements. The Battle of Lodi, where he personally led his troops across a bridge under heavy enemy fire, solidified his legendary status among his men. They began to call him Le Petit Caporal, a term of endearment that reflected both his relatively small stature and their immense respect for his courage and leadership. Victories at Arcole and Rivoli soon followed, each a testament to his audacious tactics and his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty. He transformed a dispirited army into an unstoppable machine, conquering Italy and forcing Austria to the negotiating table. Beyond the battlefield, Napoleon demonstrated an innate understanding of propaganda and public image. He meticulously crafted dispatches, exaggerating victories and downplaying setbacks, ensuring that his triumphs resonated not only in the camps, but also in the streets of Paris. He presented himself as the savior of France, the defender of republican ideals, even as his actions hinted at a more personal ambition. This mastery of narrative allowed him to control public perception, cultivating an image of an invincible general, a man destined for greatness. Amidst these military conquests, Napoleon's personal life took a dramatic turn with the introduction of Josephine de Beauharnais. 6 years his senior, Josephine was a captivating and influential socialite, a widow with 2 children, who navigated the treacherous waters of Parisian society with grace and cunning. Their romance was a whirlwind of passionate letters and fervent declarations, culminating in a swift marriage. For Napoleon, Josephine was not merely a lover. She represented a connection to the established Parisian elite, offering a different kind of power, a social legitimacy that his Corsican background lacked. Her past, though shadowed by scandal, also provided her with a network of connections that proved invaluable. Napoleon's attachment to Josephine was profound, almost obsessive. His letters, filled with expressions of longing and adoration, revealed a rare vulnerability in the ruthless general. He was a man of stark contrasts, a brilliant strategist capable of unimaginable cruelty on the battlefield, yet utterly devoted to his wife. He showered her with affection, even as rumors of her infidelity reached him, revealing a complex emotional landscape beneath his iron exterior. This duality, the ruthless general and the devoted husband, added another layer to his enigmatic persona. The Italian campaign also proved to be a goldmine. Napoleon, ever pragmatic, ensured that the conquered territories contributed significantly to the French treasury. Art, treasures, and vast sums of money were plundered from Italian cities, enriching France, and by extension, Napoleon himself. This influx of wealth further cemented his reputation as a provider, a general who not only brought victory, but also prosperity. Across Europe, the news of his exploits spread like wildfire, instilling both fear and admiration. Monarchs watched with growing unease as this Corsican upstart dismantled armies and redrew maps, his name becoming synonymous with an unstoppable force. The intoxicating taste of victory and power was now firmly in his grasp, fueling an ambition that knew no bounds. He was no longer merely a general. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature reshaping the destiny of a continent. The intoxicating taste of victory and power was now firmly in Napoleon Bonaparte's grasp, fueling an ambition that knew no bounds. He was no longer merely a general. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature reshaping the destiny of a continent. Yet, even with Italy subdued and Austria humbled, his gaze extended beyond the familiar battlefields of Europe. He envisioned a grander stage, a more audacious challenge, to strike at the very heart of British power, not directly, but through its sprawling colonial interests in the East. This desire gave birth to the ambitious and ultimately doomed Egyptian campaign, a venture that epitomized both his strategic genius and his occasional overreach. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on this exotic expedition, leading a formidable fleet and an army of 38,000 men across the Mediterranean. His initial objective was clear: to disrupt Britain's vital trade routes to India and establish a French presence that would undermine their global dominance. Upon landing in Egypt, the first engagements appeared to confirm his tactical superiority. The Battle of the Pyramids, fought in the shadow of ancient monuments, saw his disciplined French squares decisively defeat the Mamluk cavalry. This victory, though militarily significant, was also masterfully exploited for propaganda, portraying Napoleon as a liberator, a figure destined to bring enlightenment to the ancient lands. The mystique of Egypt, combined with his military prowess, further burnished his legend in the eyes of the French public. However, the sands of Egypt held unforeseen perils. While Napoleon's army celebrated their land victories, the British Royal Navy, under the brilliant command of Admiral Nelson, was relentlessly pursuing the French fleet. In August 1798, Nelson caught the French at anchor in Aboukir Bay, delivering a devastating blow at the Battle of the Nile. The French fleet was annihilated, effectively stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt and severing their supply lines to France. This decisive naval defeat was a stark reminder of British maritime supremacy and a critical turning point in the campaign. Suddenly, the grand ambition of conquering the East became a perilous struggle for survival, with the desert and disease proving to be as formidable adversaries as any army. Despite the military setbacks, Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, sought to extract every possible benefit from his predicament. He initiated extensive scientific and cultural endeavors, bringing a contingent of scholars, scientists, and artists to document the ancient wonders of Egypt. This intellectual curiosity, a characteristic often overlooked amidst his military exploits, led to the monumental discovery of the Rosetta Stone. This artifact, inscribed with hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek scripts, would later provide the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, a profound contribution to human knowledge. Even while isolated and facing an increasingly dire situation, Napoleon understood the power of discovery and the lasting legacy it could forge. As the Egyptian adventure sputtered, news began to filter back to Napoleon of growing political instability and potential collapse within France. The Directory, weakened by corruption and internal feuding, was on the brink of implosion, its authority eroding rapidly. Napoleon, with his characteristic blend of decisiveness and opportunism, recognized this as a critical window of opportunity. He understood that his future lay not in the scorching deserts of Egypt, but in the turbulent streets of Paris. In a move that underscored his ruthless ambition and his willingness to abandon his men when it served his greater purpose, he made the daring decision to return to France, secretly abandoning his army to their fate. His clandestine journey across the Mediterranean, dodging British patrols, was fraught with danger, a testament to his sheer audacity. Upon his arrival in France in October 1799, he was met not with condemnation for deserting his troops, but with rapturous applause. The French public, weary of political turmoil and longing for a strong leader, saw him as a savior. The stage was set for the coup of 18 Brumaire, a meticulously planned seizure of power that would irrevocably alter the course of French history. With the strategic assistance of his brothers, Lucien and Joseph Bonaparte, and other key allies, Napoleon orchestrated a bloodless coup d'etat. He skillfully manipulated the legislative councils, using his military popularity to intimidate and coerce. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon and his co-conspirators dissolved the Directory, replacing it with a new government known as the Consulate. He, of course, positioned himself as the first consul, effectively becoming the most powerful man in France. This masterful manipulation of political factions demonstrated his extraordinary ability to navigate the complex web of allegiances and ambitions that characterized post-revolutionary France. He played upon the public's desire for order and stability, promising an end to the chaos that had plagued the nation for years. The consolidation of his power was swift and decisive, paving the way for absolute rule. He systematically dismantled any opposition, silencing dissent and centralizing authority. The republican ideals that had fueled the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, were subtly, yet fundamentally, betrayed for personal gain. Napoleon, driven by an insatiable hunger for power and a profound belief in his own destiny, transformed France from a republic into an authoritarian state, laying the groundwork for an empire that would soon dominate Europe. The Egyptian gamble, though costly in lives and resources, had inadvertently provided him with the perfect pretext to return as France's potential savior, a role he seized with both hands, ushering in a new era defined by his singular will. As first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte wasted no time in demonstrating his formidable administrative prowess, turning his attention from the battlefield to the intricate task of rebuilding a fractured nation. France, after a decade of revolution and instability, yearned for order, and Napoleon, with his characteristic blend of efficiency and vision, was determined to provide it. His immediate focus was on stabilizing the economy, a crucial step in restoring public confidence and laying the groundwork for future prosperity. He initiated sweeping financial reforms, curbing inflation, and establishing a robust system of taxation that finally brought fiscal discipline to the chaotic state coffers. The establishment of the Bank of France in 1800 was a cornerstone of this economic recovery, providing a centralized institution to manage state finances and issue a stable currency, a stark contrast to the worthless assignats of the revolutionary era. Beyond economic revitalization, Napoleon embarked on an ambitious program of legal and social reform, the most enduring symbol of which was the Napoleonic Code. Promulgated in 1804, this comprehensive body of civil law codified much of the French legal system, ensuring equality before the law, protecting property rights, and abolishing feudal privileges. It was a revolutionary achievement, blending Roman law with revolutionary principles, and its influence would eventually spread across Europe and beyond, shaping modern legal systems worldwide. This monumental legal framework cemented his image as a modernizer and a bringer of order, appealing to a populace weary of arbitrary rule and legal confusion. Recognizing the deep religious divisions that had plagued France since the Revolution, Napoleon also sought to heal the rift between the state and the Catholic Church. The Concordat of 1801, signed with Pope Pius VII, was a stroke of diplomatic genius. It acknowledged Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, while simultaneously asserting the state's control over church appointments and finances. This pragmatic agreement brought an end to religious persecution, allowing the church to resume its activities in France, and crucially, garnered Napoleon the support of many devout Catholics who had previously viewed the revolutionary government with hostility. It was a testament to his understanding of the popular psyche and his willingness to compromise for the sake of national unity. Under Napoleon's leadership, France experienced a period of unprecedented stability and growth. Infrastructure projects flourished, with new roads, canals, and bridges connecting disparate regions and facilitating trade. Education was reformed, and a merit-based system was introduced for public service, replacing the old aristocratic privileges. This era of peace and prosperity, following years of turmoil, saw Napoleon's popularity soar to dizzying heights. He was genuinely admired by the populace, who saw him as the architect of their renewed national pride and economic well-being. The image of the strong, decisive leader who had brought an end to chaos resonated deeply with the French people. However, beneath the veneer of stability and reform, Napoleon's authoritarian tendencies began to assert themselves more overtly. While he championed equality before the law, he simultaneously suppressed political dissent with an iron fist. Freedom of the press was curtailed, political opponents were silenced, and a pervasive system of surveillance was implemented. The illusion of a republican government gradually eroded as power became increasingly centralized in his hands. He was a man who believed implicitly in his own judgment, and while this had served him well on the battlefield, it now manifested as an intolerance for opposition. The logical culmination of this consolidation of power and his boundless ambition was the desire for a permanent, hereditary title. The title of First Consul, though powerful, still carried the lingering echoes of republicanism, a system he had long outgrown in his own mind. He believed that only a hereditary monarchy could truly guarantee the stability and grandeur he envisioned for France and for his own legacy. Thus, in 1804, through a plebiscite that was overwhelmingly ratified by the French people, Napoleon transitioned from First Consul to Emperor of the French. It was an audacious move, a complete break with the revolutionary past, yet presented as a logical evolution for the nation's security and glory. The self-coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte on December 2, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, was a spectacle of immense historical significance. In a symbolic act that underscored his ultimate authority, he famously took the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it upon his own head, signaling that his power derived not from divine right, but from his own will and the will of the French people. Josephine de Beauharnais, his beloved wife, was also crowned empress, a moment of triumph for her, though the shadow of an heir, an issue that would later become agonizingly central to their relationship, already loomed large. This act of self-coronation was a deliberate and powerful statement, establishing a new imperial dynasty and solidifying his absolute control over France. The outrage and fear among the established European monarchies were palpable. They viewed Napoleon, a Corsican upstart who had risen from obscurity, as a dangerous revolutionary, the embodiment of everything they had fought to suppress. His imperial ambitions threatened the ancient order, and the crowning of an emperor who was not of royal blood was an affront to their very legitimacy. The stage was now set for a prolonged and brutal conflict, as the old world braced itself against the boundless ambition of the man who had dared to crown himself. The absolute power now firmly in his grasp, Fueling an ambition that knew no bounds, Napoleon stood at the precipice of an era that would reshape the map of Europe and forever alter the course of history. With the imperial crown firmly upon his head, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his gaze outward, his ambition now unrestricted by the pretense of republicanism. France was his, and his vision for its grandeur extended far beyond its borders. To achieve this, he needed an instrument of unparalleled power and precision. Thus began the meticulous formation of the Grande Armée, a fighting force that would redefine warfare and strike fear into the hearts of monarchs across Europe. This was no mere collection of conscripts. It was a meticulously organized, highly trained, and fiercely loyal engine of conquest, forged in the crucible of revolutionary fervor and Napoleonic discipline. Each corps was a self-sufficient army, capable of independent action, yet perfectly integrated into Napoleon's overarching strategic design. Their speed, maneuverability, and sheer fighting spirit became legendary, a reflection of their emperor's own relentless drive. The established powers of Europe, however, watched with growing alarm. The self-proclaimed emperor, a man who had already humbled Austria and defied Britain, represented an existential threat to their ancient dynasties. The Third Coalition soon crystallized, an alliance of formidable adversaries. The seemingly inexhaustible naval might of Britain, the vast land armies of Austria, and the resolute, if somewhat ponderous, forces of Russia. They sought to curb Napoleon's burgeoning power, to restore the old order, and to prevent the spread of his revolutionary ideals, which, even cloaked in imperial splendor, still unsettled their absolute rule. Napoleon, ever the proactive strategist, did not wait for this coalition to fully coalesce. His response was swift and decisive, a masterclass in military deception and rapid maneuver. In the autumn of 1805, he unleashed the Grande Armée on the unsuspecting Austrians, executing what would become known as the Ulm campaign. Feigning a frontal assault, Napoleon instead swung his forces in a vast, encircling movement, catching the Austrian army under General Mack completely by surprise. The speed and precision of the French advance were breathtaking, a testament to the Grande Armée's superior organization and Napoleon's genius for logistics. Without a major pitched battle, the entire Austrian force of over 25 Zeeauerwiesen men was encircled and forced to surrender at Ulm. It was a humiliating capitulation, a stark demonstration of Napoleon's ability to win campaigns through maneuver rather than brute force, shattering the illusion of Austrian military competence. The victory at Ulm, while significant, was merely a prelude to Napoleon's greatest tactical masterpiece, the Battle of Austerlitz. Known to history as the Battle of the Three Emperors, it unfolded on December 2, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation, a date he undoubtedly chose with symbolic intent. Arrayed against him on the frozen plains of Moravia were the combined armies of Emperor Francis II of Austria and Emperor Alexander I of Russia, forces numerically superior to his own. Napoleon, however, had meticulously studied the terrain, the dispositions of his enemies, and their commanders' predictable tendencies. He deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the Allied forces into a trap, convincing them of an easy victory. The Allied generals, blinded by overconfidence and misunderstanding Napoleon's intentions, fell for the bait. As the morning mist lifted, revealing the sun of Austerlitz, as it would forever be known, Napoleon unleashed his forces. His carefully concealed IV Corps, under Marshal Soult, surged forward, seizing the strategically vital Pratzen Heights, the very ground the Allied command had abandoned in their pursuit of the French right flank. This single, audacious stroke split the Allied army in two, isolating their left wing from the center and right. What followed was a brutal, relentless assault, with Napoleon masterfully orchestrating his corps, flanking movements, and artillery fire. The Allied lines disintegrated under the relentless pressure, their commanders unable to react effectively to Napoleon's lightning-fast decisions and the unyielding pressure of the Grande Armée. The battle devolved into a rout, with thousands of Allied soldiers attempting to escape across frozen ponds, only for French artillery to shatter the ice beneath them, sending countless men to a frigid, watery grave. The victory at Austerlitz was absolute, a crushing defeat for the Third Coalition and a profound humiliation for the old European powers. It was not merely a military triumph, but a psychological one, solidifying Napoleon's reputation as an invincible military genius. The battlefield was littered with the dead and dying, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting, but also to the brilliance of the French emperor. The combined Austrian and Russian forces had been utterly shattered, their armies decimated, their pride irrevocably wounded. The immediate consequence of Austerlitz was the treaties of Pressburg, signed later that same month. Austria, utterly defeated and demoralized, was forced to cede vast territories, including Venice and Dalmatia, to Napoleon's burgeoning empire and its client states. This treaty also marked the effective end of the ancient and venerable Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, loose confederation that had dominated Central European politics for centuries. In its place, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states allied with France and under his direct influence, serving as a buffer against further Eastern aggression. At this moment, Napoleon stood at the absolute zenith of his military power and strategic genius. The emperor and his Grande Armée seemed truly invincible, capable of overcoming any obstacle, humbling any foe. The intoxicating taste of absolute dominion filled his senses, a dangerous elixir that would only fuel his ever-expanding ambitions. The world watched, aghast and awestruck, as this Corsican upstart remade the map of Europe with the stroke of his pen and the might of his sword. He had demonstrated that old notions of power and legitimacy were fragile, susceptible to the will of a single, extraordinary man. The lessons of Austerlitz would resonate for generations, a chilling reminder that even the most established order could be shattered by audacious genius. Despite the monumental victories and the seemingly unassailable position he had carved out for himself on the European continent, one persistent thorn remained in Napoleon Bonaparte's side: Britain. The island nation, protected by its formidable navy and its unyielding resolve, remained unconquered, a constant challenge to his vision of a French-dominated Europe. Its maritime supremacy rendered a direct invasion impossible, a frustration that gnawed at the emperor. He understood that to truly solidify his control, to remove the last bastion of resistance against his imperial ambitions, he had to cripple Britain not by land, but by economy. Thus, the continental system was conceived, a grand, audacious economic blockade designed to isolate and financially starve his most tenacious enemy. Napoleon decreed that no nation under his influence, or any nation wishing to trade with France, could engage in commerce with Britain. His intention was clear: to cut off Britain's vital export markets and sources of raw materials, thereby collapsing its economy and forcing it to sue for peace. The decree rippled across Europe, demanding compliance from allies and conquered territories alike. Ports that once bustled with British goods now stood silent, or worse, became targets for French customs officials. However, the implementation of the continental system proved to be a far more complex and ultimately self-defeating endeavor than Napoleon had envisioned. Britain, a global maritime power, quickly found alternative markets and sources, particularly in its vast colonial empire and through illicit trade routes. Meanwhile, the very nations Napoleon sought to control chafed under the restrictions. Widespread resentment festered as their economies suffered. Merchants, desperate to maintain their livelihoods, resorted to rampant smuggling, creating a black market that undermined the entire system. Goods that were once freely available became scarce and expensive, fueling popular discontent and making Napoleon's benevolent rule feel more like an oppressive burden. The enforcement of the continental system became a relentless, often brutal campaign that stretched Napoleon's resources and diplomatic patience to their limits. When Portugal, an old ally of Britain, defiantly refused to comply with the blockade, Napoleon saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. In 1807, he ordered an invasion, swiftly occupying the country and forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. This act of aggression, ostensibly to enforce his economic policy, inadvertently opened a Pandora's box that would bleed his empire for years. The invasion of Portugal necessitated the movement of French troops through Spain, a nation whose Bourbon monarchy was weak and internally divided. Seeing an opportunity to further consolidate his control over the Iberian Peninsula and ensure the blockade's integrity, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He cunningly exploited the internal squabbles within the Spanish royal family, ultimately deposing King Charles IV and his son, Ferdinand VII. In their place, he installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new King of Spain in 1808. This act of blatant foreign imposition was a catastrophic miscalculation of Spanish national pride and religious fervor. What followed was the brutal, protracted conflict known as the Peninsular War, a 6-year struggle that would become a festering wound in the heart of Napoleon's empire. The Spanish people, fiercely independent and deeply Catholic, refused to accept a foreign king, particularly one imposed by the very nation that had executed their own monarch and suppressed their church. They rose up in a spontaneous, widespread rebellion, employing a new, unpredictable form of warfare: guerrilla tactics. Small bands of partisans, knowing their terrain intimately, struck unexpectedly at French supply lines, isolated garrisons, and marching columns, then vanished into the rugged mountains. This was not the grand, set-piece battle Napoleon was accustomed to. It was a war of attrition, of constant harassment, of unseen enemies. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon himself would later call it, proved to be an insatiable drain on French resources, manpower, and morale. Tens of thousands of Napoleon's finest troops, veterans of Austerlitz and Ulm, were tied down in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, fighting a war they could not win decisively. The constant need for reinforcements and supplies diverted crucial resources from other fronts, weakening his overall strategic position. Adding to Napoleon's woes, Britain, ever opportunistic, saw the Peninsular War as a chance to directly engage French forces on land. Under the brilliant leadership of Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, British expeditionary forces landed in Portugal and, alongside their Spanish and Portuguese allies, fought a series of grinding campaigns against the French. Wellington's disciplined troops and tactical acumen proved a constant, formidable challenge, inflicting defeats that slowly eroded the myth of French invincibility. The moral cost of the occupation and repression was immense. French soldiers, accustomed to swift victories, found themselves embroiled in a savage war where no quarter was given or expected. Atrocities were committed by both sides, hardening the resolve of the Spanish people and fueling a cycle of violence. The once unblemished facade of Napoleon's invincibility began to crack under the relentless pressure of this unconventional conflict. The Peninsular War was a constant, agonizing reminder that even the mightiest empire could be bled dry by the unwavering spirit of a people determined to fight for their freedom. It was a war that Napoleon, for all his genius, could never truly win, and its shadow would loom large over his subsequent, even more ambitious, endeavors. The relentless drain of the Peninsular War, coupled with the grinding economic pressures of the continental system, served as stark reminders of the empire's vulnerabilities. Yet, amidst these growing cracks in his formidable edifice, another, more personal void gnawed at Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a void that threatened not merely the stability of his reign, but the very longevity of his dynastic ambitions. the desperate need for a legitimate heir. For all his military genius and political acumen, he remained, ironically, powerless in the face of nature's dictates. Josephine, his beloved empress, the woman who had stood by him through his meteoric rise, was unable to provide him with a child. Years had passed since their passionate union, and the hope for an heir born of their love had dwindled to a painful whisper. This barrenness, a cruel twist of fate, became an increasingly pressing concern as Napoleon solidified his imperial rule. An emperor without an heir was an emperor whose legacy was fragile, whose dynasty could crumble upon his death. The future of France, as he envisioned it, depended on a clear line of succession, a direct descendant to inherit the mantle of power. The whispers in the courts, the anxieties of his marshals, and his own profound sense of duty to establish a lasting legacy all coalesced into an agonizing, almost unbearable pressure. Josephine, acutely aware of her inability to fulfill this most crucial imperial duty, lived under a constant shadow of dread, her once vibrant spirit now tinged with melancholy. The decision, when it finally came, was perhaps the most heart-wrenching Napoleon ever had to make. It was a choice between the love of his life and the perceived salvation of his empire. The weight of his ambition, the demands of his dynasty, ultimately outweighed the profound emotional attachment he held for Josephine. Napoleon resolved to divorce her, a political necessity cloaked in profound personal sacrifice. The scene of their farewell, private and tearful, was a testament to the complex, often cruel, interplay between personal affection and political imperative. Josephine, ever graceful, accepted her fate with dignity, understanding the immense stakes involved. Their bond, forged in the fires of revolution and ambition, would forever bear the scars of this agonizing separation, a testament to the human cost of imperial power. With the painful chapter of his first marriage closed, Napoleon immediately embarked on a new, strategically calculated marital alliance. His gaze turned towards the ancient venerable houses of Europe, specifically to the Habsburg dynasty, the very family he had so repeatedly humbled on the battlefield. It was a move that stunned Europe, a shocking display of political pragmatism that transcended historical animosities. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, the Archduchess of Austria, daughter of Emperor Francis I. She was young, inexperienced, and a direct link to one of the oldest and most prestigious royal families on the continent. This union was not born of love, but of cold, calculated strategy, to secure a legitimate heir and to forge an alliance with a major European power, ostensibly bringing Austria into his sphere of influence and further isolating Britain. The marriage was a spectacular affair, a lavish display of power and prestige designed to impress and intimidate. For Napoleon, it was the ultimate symbol of his triumph, marrying into the very lineage that had once considered him an upstart Corsican. For Austria, it was a bitter pill, a reluctant acceptance of their conqueror, but one that offered a temporary reprieve from further French aggression and a chance for diplomatic maneuvering. The irony of the situation was not lost on the European courts. The man who had dismantled the Holy Roman Empire and repeatedly defeated Austrian armies now stood as son-in-law to its emperor. The strategic marriage quickly bore the fruit Napoleon so desperately craved. In March 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, Napoleon François Charles Joseph Bonaparte, immediately proclaimed Napoleon II, the King of Rome. The birth of this imperial heir was met with widespread celebration across France, a seemingly unassailable affirmation of Napoleon's dynastic ambitions. The cannon volleys announcing his arrival echoed across the continent, signaling the apparent fulfillment of the emperor's greatest personal desire. He now had a direct successor, a guarantee that his empire would endure beyond his own lifetime. The young King of Rome was paraded before the public, a tangible symbol of the new imperial order. a future monarch whose very existence seemed to secure the future of the French Empire. This union with the ancient Habsburg dynasty and the subsequent birth of his son instilled in Napoleon a renewed sense of confidence, almost an invincibility. He believed he had finally secured his place in history, cementing his power through both military might and dynastic legitimacy. The alliance with Austria, seemingly solid, provided a sense of false security, masking the underlying tensions and resentments that still simmered beneath the surface of European politics. The other powers, though temporarily quieted by the display of strength and the strategic marriage, watched with wary eyes, their fear of Napoleon only slightly tempered by this new alignment. Yet, as the years of his reign progressed, this immense power and the apparent fulfillment of his dynastic dreams fostered a growing arrogance in the emperor. He became increasingly isolated, surrounded by sycophants and those unwilling to challenge his decisions. The strategic calculations that had once been so sharp and nuanced began to be overshadowed by an unshakable belief in his own infallibility. The man who had once risen from humble beginnings to conquer a continent now seemed to view himself as above the ordinary constraints of diplomacy and human endurance. This growing isolation, coupled with an escalating sense of hubris, would soon lead him to make a monumental miscalculation, one that would unravel the very empire he had so painstakingly built, despite the precious heir now secured. The stage was set for a gamble that would test the limits of his genius and the endurance of his Grande Armée, a gamble that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. The emperor's increasing arrogance, born from his unparalleled successes and the recent triumph of securing a legitimate heir, began to cloud his strategic judgment. He had secured the King of Rome, forged an alliance with Austria, and seemingly cemented his dynasty. Yet, a formidable challenge still loomed large on the eastern horizon: Russia. Tensions with Emperor Alexander had been steadily escalating, primarily fueled by Russia's growing resentment over the continental system. The economic blockade, designed to cripple Britain, was instead strangling Russia's own trade and economy, causing widespread discontent among its nobility. Furthermore, Napoleon's veiled ambitions concerning the restoration of a Polish state, which would inevitably come at the expense of Russian territory, served as a constant irritant, a simmering threat that Alexander could not ignore. The strategic marriage to Marie-Louise, while securing an Austrian alliance, had done little to assuage Russian fears of French hegemony over Eastern Europe. Napoleon, convinced of his own military genius and the invincibility of his Grande Armée, viewed Russia's defiance as an intolerable affront to his imperial authority. He saw Alexander's wavering commitment to the continental system as a betrayal, a direct challenge to his vision for a unified, French-dominated Europe. The emperor's hubris, now almost boundless, led him to make the ultimate gamble, a full-scale invasion of Russia. This was not merely a punitive expedition. It was a grand design to force Alexander into absolute submission, to extend French influence to the very borders of Asia, and to finally break Britain's economic lifeline by closing off all remaining European markets. It was a monumental undertaking, a decision that would test the very limits of human endurance and military logistics. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army the world had ever seen up to that point, the Grande Armée, numbering over 600 men. This colossal force was a multinational mosaic, comprising not only French veterans, but also conscripts and contingents from his vassal states and reluctant allies, Germans, Italians, Poles, Swiss, and even a small Austrian corps. Their objective was clear: march deep into Russia, engage the enemy in a decisive battle, and dictate peace terms from the heart of the Russian Empire. The initial advance was swift, but fraught with challenges. The vast distances, poor roads, and scorching summer heat began to take their toll even before the first major engagement. The Russian strategy, however, proved unexpectedly cunning. Instead of offering direct battle, they employed a brutal, scorched earth policy, retreating deeper into their vast territory, burning crops, destroying villages, and poisoning wells as they went. This denied the Grande Armée vital supplies and forced them to rely on increasingly stretched and vulnerable supply lines. The relentless pursuit finally culminated in the bloody Battle of Borodino, fought just 70 miles west of Moscow. On September 7, 1812, two of the largest armies in history clashed in a ferocious all-day engagement. It was a battle of unprecedented scale and savagery, a grinding meat grinder that cost both sides dearly. Napoleon, despite heavy casualties, ultimately forced the Russian army to retreat, claiming a tactical victory. Yet it was a Pyrrhic one. The Russian army, though battered, was not destroyed, and their morale remained unbroken. The cost in lives was staggering. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded on the field, a grim testament to the battle's ferocity. The Grande Armée had won, but the victory felt hollow, devoid of the decisive, annihilating triumph Napoleon so desperately sought. Just a week later, Napoleon and his exhausted, depleted army entered Moscow, the ancient capital of Russia. The city, however, was eerily deserted. Emperor Alexander I, displaying an iron will and an unwavering resolve, had ordered its evacuation. As French troops settled in, hoping for respite and provisions, a series of devastating fires erupted across the city. Whether accidental or deliberately set by Russian saboteurs, the conflagration quickly engulfed Moscow, turning it into a raging inferno. The Grande Armée found itself trapped in a burning city, its hopes for winter quarters and supplies reduced to ashes. The psychological impact on the troops was immense. The capture of the enemy capital had yielded only desolation and despair. Napoleon, despite the catastrophic turn of events, clung to the hope that Alexander would now negotiate. He sent repeated overtures, confident that the fall of his capital would break the Russian emperor's spirit. But Alexander, from his new seat of power, remained steadfast. He refused to parley, understanding that time and the vastness of his country were his greatest allies. He knew that the harsh Russian winter, an enemy more formidable than any army, was rapidly approaching. The first biting winds and early snows began to fall, signaling the impending doom. Napoleon, faced with a burning city, dwindling supplies, and an unyielding enemy, was forced to confront an impossible decision. He could not winter in Moscow. The city offered no refuge, and his army was already weakening. Retreat, however, meant an arduous, perilous journey across hundreds of miles of frozen, hostile territory with winter's full fury about to descend. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, on October 19, 1812, Napoleon issued the order to retreat. It was a catastrophic error in judgment, a monumental miscalculation that would seal the fate of his Grande Armée and mark the beginning of the end for his empire. The retreat from Moscow was not merely a withdrawal, it was the genesis of one of the greatest military disasters in history. The once mighty Grande Armée, now a shadow of its former self, began its long, desperate march westward, already battered by battle, hunger, and disease. The psychological toll of a war without decisive victory, combined with the grim reality of a burning capital and an unyielding foe, weighed heavily on the emperor and his men. The hubris that had driven Napoleon to undertake this audacious gamble had now set in motion a chain of events that would unravel his carefully constructed empire, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable suffering and devastation. The cold, unforgiving grip of the Russian winter was about to close around them, promising a relentless, brutal demise. The retreat from Moscow quickly devolved into an unimaginable nightmare. The vast, frozen plains of Russia became a chilling backdrop to a human catastrophe of epic proportions. Starvation gnawed at the soldiers' guts, their bodies weakened by months of campaigning and insufficient provisions. Frostbite, an insidious enemy, claimed fingers, toes, and limbs, turning men into hobbling, disfigured wrecks. The once proud uniforms of the Grande Armée, now tattered rags, offered little protection against the biting winds and relentless snow. Their breath froze in plumes, their steps crunched on the icy ground, each one a testament to their dwindling hope. Adding to the relentless torment of the elements were the incessant attacks by Russian Cossacks. These elusive, fierce horsemen, perfectly adapted to the harsh terrain, harried the retreating columns relentlessly. They struck with terrifying speed, cutting off stragglers, capturing supply wagons, and inflicting heavy casualties before melting back into the white wilderness. The psychological impact of these constant raids was devastating. There was no moment of true rest, no sense of security. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking enemy. Every gust of wind carried the whisper of impending attack. The Grande Armée, once a symbol of Napoleonic might, was being systematically decimated, not by a single decisive battle, but by 1,000 cuts inflicted by nature and an unyielding foe. Napoleon, witnessing the unraveling of his grand design, understood the gravity of the situation. His army, his very instrument of power, was dissolving before his eyes. The news of this catastrophic failure would undoubtedly embolden his enemies across Europe, sparking a fresh wave of resistance. With a heavy heart, but a clear strategic mind, he made a desperate, secret dash back to Paris. Leaving the shattered remnants of his army under the command of his marshals, he traveled disguised, racing across the continent in a sleigh, driven by a singular, urgent purpose: to raise new armies, to salvage what remained of his empire. His presence in Paris was essential to quell any potential uprisings or coups that might arise from the news of the Russian disaster. Indeed, as news of the Grande Armée's decimation spread like wildfire across Europe, a tremor of renewed hope and defiance ran through the capitals of the old monarchies. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility, so carefully cultivated and so long believed, had been shattered on the icy plains of Russia. The once unconquerable emperor had bled, and bled profusely. Sensing this profound weakness, a sixth coalition began to coalesce with alarming speed. Britain, ever the implacable foe, poured resources into the alliance. Russia, emboldened by its miraculous survival, committed its forces with renewed vigor. Prussia, long chafing under French domination, saw its chance for liberation. And perhaps most significantly, Austria, Napoleon's recent ally through marriage, began to weigh its options, its loyalty wavering in the face of such a monumental defeat. The once feared French hegemony was now perceived as vulnerable, a colossus with feet of clay. Former allies, once bound by treaties or subjugation, now began to turn against him. The most prominent among these betrayals came from Marshal Bernadotte, a former French marshal who had become Crown Prince of Sweden. Bernadotte, once a comrade in arms, now openly joined the coalition, his intimate knowledge of French tactics and Napoleon's personality posing a significant threat. This act of disloyalty was a bitter pill for Napoleon to swallow, a stark reminder that personal ambition and national interest often superseded old loyalties. Within his own ranks, too, a growing weariness and disloyalty began to fester. The endless campaigns, the staggering losses of life, and the sheer brutality of the Russian retreat had taken their toll. Many of his marshals, though still outwardly loyal, harbored deep resentments and doubts about the emperor's judgment. The common soldiers, the backbone of his army, were exhausted, disillusioned, and yearned for peace. The fervent, almost fanatical devotion that had once characterized the Grande Armée was eroding, replaced by a grim determination to survive and a growing questioning of the sacrifices demanded of them. The myth of invincibility, which had been Napoleon's most potent psychological weapon, had been irrevocably shattered. No longer was he seen as the unstoppable force of nature, the tactical genius who could bend any foe to his will. He was now a man who had made a catastrophic error, a leader whose ambition had led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of his men. The profound emotional impact of losing so many men, not in glorious battle, but to the elements and starvation, weighed heavily on the collective consciousness of France and Europe. The human cost of his Russian gamble was immeasurable, a gaping wound that would take generations to heal. Despite the overwhelming odds, Napoleon clung to power with a desperate tenacity. His return to Paris was met with a mix of relief and dread. He immediately set about the Herculean task of raising new armies, drafting young conscripts, and scrambling for resources. He knew that the world was closing in, that the combined might of Europe was preparing to strike. Yet in his heart, a flicker of that old, unyielding self-belief remained. He was still Napoleon, and he would fight to the last breath. But the once unconquerable emperor was now fighting for his very survival, cornered and beleaguered, facing a future far more uncertain than any he had ever known. The echoes of the Russian winter and the cries of his lost men would forever haunt his steps. Despite the crushing weight of the Russian catastrophe and the burgeoning coalition against him, Napoleon Bonaparte, with characteristic defiance, embarked on a furious, almost manic effort to rebuild his forces. His brilliant mind, though scarred by the recent debacle, still sought solutions, still conceived grand strategies. He crisscrossed France, his presence a whirlwind of energy, demanding, inspiring, and cajoling. The nation, though weary, still possessed a deep reservoir of loyalty and fear. Yet, the armies he managed to conjure from the depleted manpower of France were a stark contrast to the seasoned veterans of the Grande Armée. These new recruits were mere boys, barely out of adolescence, their faces still smooth, their bodies unhardened by years of campaigning. They were the Marie-Louises, named after his empress, a poignant testament to the youth and inexperience of this last desperate levy. They possessed spirit, undoubtedly, but lacked the brutal experience, the discipline, and the sheer physical endurance that had once defined Napoleon's legions. These young, inexperienced conscripts were now pitted against the hardened, vengeful, and increasingly unified forces of the Sixth Coalition, a formidable alliance comprising the British, Russians, Prussians, and Austrians, all eager to finally put an end to the Napoleonic threat. The inevitable clash came in October 1813, near the city of Leipzig, in what would become known as the Battle of Leipzig, or more ominously, the Battle of Nations. It was a confrontation on a scale unprecedented in European history, a colossal struggle involving over 500,000 soldiers, a maelstrom of musketry, cannon fire, and cavalry charges that stretched for 4 brutal days. Napoleon, commanding a force of roughly 200 Zuaziran men, found himself encircled by the combined armies of the coalition, numbering closer to 380 Zuaziran. He fought with his usual tactical brilliance, orchestrating complex maneuvers, shifting reserves, and exploiting every advantage. For a time, it seemed his genius might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. However, the sheer numerical superiority of the Allies, coupled with the inexperience of many of his troops and the wavering loyalty of some of his German allies who defected mid-battle, proved too overwhelming. The battle was a meat grinder, a relentless exchange of lives that slowly but surely ground down the French defenses. The Emperor himself, his face grim and etched with fatigue, watched as his empire crumbled around him, one lost skirmish, one shattered battalion, one retreating corps at a time. The defeat at Leipzig was crushing, decisive, and irreparable. It marked the first time Napoleon had been truly defeated on a scale that irrevocably altered the balance of power. The myth of his invincibility, already severely dented in Russia, was now shattered beyond repair. With the heart of his German Confederation broken, the coalition forces, emboldened and unified, began their inexorable invasion of France itself. For the first time since the early days of the Revolution, French soil was threatened by foreign armies. The year 1814 saw Napoleon engaged in one of the most brilliant, yet ultimately futile defensive campaigns of his career. With a fraction of his former strength, he masterfully outmaneuvered and inflicted local defeats upon the invading Allied armies, buying precious time, hoping for a miracle. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, inspiring his young conscripts to acts of incredible bravery. Yet, his efforts were a desperate rearguard action against an overwhelming tide. The Allied armies, though momentarily checked, simply had too many men, too many resources, and too much single-minded determination. They converged on Paris, the capital itself, the beating heart of his empire. As the Allied armies closed in, the internal cracks within Napoleon's regime widened into chasms. His marshals, many of whom had served him for years, were exhausted, disillusioned, and saw the writing on the wall. They began to defect, to refuse orders, to openly defy his increasingly desperate commands. Political allies, sensing the imminent collapse, abandoned him in droves, eager to secure their own positions in the inevitable new order. The people of Paris, ravaged by years of war and now facing occupation, were weary of the constant struggle, their initial fervor replaced by a longing for peace. On March 31st, 1814, Paris, the city that had once celebrated his triumphal entries, fell to the coalition forces. It was a humiliating blow, a symbolic end to an era. Napoleon, at Fontainebleau, received the news with a mixture of fury and despair. He still wished to fight, to lead a final desperate charge, but his marshals, led by Ney and Berthier, confronted him, refusing to continue the hopeless struggle. They demanded his abdication, making it clear that the army, and indeed France, could endure no more. Faced with the complete collapse of support, both military and political, Napoleon Bonaparte was forced to confront the unbearable reality of his defeat. On April 6, 1814, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, he signed his unconditional abdication. The pen stroke that ended his reign also severed his connection to the vast empire he had painstakingly built. In a moment of profound despair, consumed by the magnitude of his fall, he attempted suicide by taking poison, a vile concoction he had carried with him since the Russian campaign. However, the poison, weakened by time, merely induced severe illness, preventing his intended escape from the crushing burden of his failure. The Allied powers, eager to remove him from the European stage but wary of making him a martyr, dictated the terms of his exile. The Treaty of Fontainebleau stripped him of his imperial titles, though he was permitted to retain the title of emperor, albeit only of the tiny island of Elba, off the coast of Tuscany. He was granted a small pension and allowed a personal guard of 600 men. It was a gilded cage, a humiliating end for the man who had once commanded armies numbering hundreds of thousands and dictated terms to emperors and kings. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Corsican ogre, the disturber of European peace, was finally neutralized. The end of an era had arrived, or so it seemed to every weary soul across the continent. Little did they know, the eagle still had one last, astonishing flight left in him. Napoleon Bonaparte, stripped of his vast empire, found himself marooned on the small, rugged island of Elba. It was a mere speck of land in the Mediterranean, a cruel irony for a man who had once dominated an entire continent. His new domain was tiny, barely 224 square kilometers, a far cry from the sprawling territories that had once bent to his will. Yet, even in this diminished state, the emperor remained an emperor. He approached his new role as sovereign of Elba with the same meticulous attention to detail and boundless energy that he had applied to governing France. He oversaw the construction of roads, improved the island's meager infrastructure, revitalized its iron mines, and even designed a new flag for his miniature kingdom. His days were filled with administrative tasks, his mind still sharp, his drive undiminished. He received visitors, held court, and maintained a semblance of the imperial grandeur he had lost. It was a performance, perhaps, but one he played with conviction, a way to keep the fires of his ambition burning, even if only faintly. Despite the outwardly calm demeanor, Napoleon's senses remained acutely attuned to the political winds swirling across Europe. He cultivated a network of informants, receiving a constant flow of intelligence from the mainland. These reports painted a picture of growing discontent in France with the recently restored Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVIII, the corpulent, gout-ridden brother of the executed Louis XVI, had returned to the throne, but his reign was proving deeply unpopular. He alienated the army by dismissing many of Napoleon's loyal veterans and officers, replacing them with émigrés who had fled during the Revolution and now returned seeking to reclaim their old privileges. The peasantry, who had benefited from the land reforms of the Revolution, feared a return to the feudal system. The middle class, who had thrived under Napoleon's stable administration, chafed under the old aristocracy's renewed arrogance. France, it seemed, was not ready to forget the emperor who had brought them glory and order. The murmurings of dissatisfaction grew louder, reaching Napoleon's ears across the narrow stretch of sea. He saw the cracks forming in the fragile peace, the yearning for a return to the perceived stability and grandeur of his rule. The Allied powers, believing their Corsican ogre safely caged, had underestimated the depth of his cunning and the enduring power of his charisma. They had also miscalculated the resentment brewing in France. Napoleon, ever the strategist, began to formulate a plan, a daring, audacious gamble that defied all logic. He knew the risks were immense, the chances of success slim, but the lure of his former glory, the call of his destiny, was too strong to resist. He began to secretly prepare, consolidating his small guard, ensuring their unwavering loyalty, and making arrangements for a swift, decisive move. On February 26, 1815, under the cover of darkness and aided by a dense fog, Napoleon Bonaparte, along with a force of approximately 1,000 loyal soldiers, slipped away from Elba. The escape was meticulously planned, a testament to his enduring genius for organization and subterfuge. They landed on the French coast near Antibes, and from there, the impossible began to unfold. His march towards Paris became known as the Flight of the Eagle, a phrase that captured the sheer audacity and speed of his return. News of his landing sent shockwaves across France and Europe. Louis XVIII, in a state of panic, dispatched troops to apprehend the returning emperor. Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, who had abandoned him at Fontainebleau, famously boasted to Louis XVI that he would bring Bonaparte back in an iron cage. Yet as Ney's forces encountered Napoleon's small contingent, something extraordinary happened. Napoleon, dismounting from his horse, walked towards the royal troops, his iconic grey coat and bicorn hat instantly recognizable. He faced them alone, unarmed, and declared, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment recognize me. If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The effect was electrifying. Cheers erupted, muskets were dropped, and the soldiers, tears streaming down their faces, rushed forward to embrace their beloved leader. Ney himself, overcome by the magnetic presence of his former commander, broke down and rejoined Napoleon, bringing his entire corps with him. The flight of the eagle continued, gathering momentum with every passing day. Regiments sent to stop him instead swelled his ranks. Towns and cities, initially ordered to resist, opened their gates and welcomed him with rapturous applause. The fervor of his return was astonishing, a spontaneous outpouring of loyalty from a populace disillusioned with the Bourbons. On March 20th, 1815, Louis XVIII fled Paris in haste. and Napoleon, without firing a single shot, re-entered the capital, reclaiming his throne amidst scenes of wild jubilation. It was an unprecedented triumph, a testament to his enduring legend and the deep connection he still held with the French people and army. This astonishing period, lasting just over 3 months, became known as the 100 Days. Napoleon, once again Emperor of the French, knew his return would not be tolerated by the other European powers. He immediately set about the monumental task of rebuilding his army, frantically mobilizing resources, recalling veterans, and conscripting new recruits. He attempted to reassure the European monarchies that his intentions were peaceful, that he merely wished to rule France within its natural borders. But his words fell on deaf ears. Europe, traumatized by 2 decades of Napoleonic wars, had no intention of allowing the Corsican ogre to once again destabilize the continent. The Seventh Coalition quickly formed, a unified and resolute alliance determined to end his rule once and for all. It was a final, desperate gamble for redemption, a last chance for glory. But this time, the odds were stacked against him even higher than before. The world held its breath, knowing that the inevitable clash would determine the fate of Europe, and perhaps the legacy of its most extraordinary son. The Seventh Coalition, a formidable alliance of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, moved with unprecedented speed and unity. They declared Napoleon Bonaparte an outlaw, a disturber of world peace, and mobilized their armies for a final, decisive confrontation. Napoleon, fully aware of the overwhelming numerical superiority of his enemies, understood that his only chance lay in swift, aggressive action. He aimed to defeat the British and Prussian armies separately before the Austrian and Russian forces could fully deploy. This strategy, a hallmark of his military genius, had served him well in the past, but this time the stakes were impossibly high. In June 1815, Napoleon launched his final campaign, leading his newly assembled, though often inexperienced army into Belgium. His plan was audacious: to drive a wedge between the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Dutch forces and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher's Prussians, then defeat each in turn. The initial movements were promising, with French forces engaging the Prussians at Ligny and the British at Quatre Bras on June 16th. While neither engagement was a decisive victory for Napoleon, they seemed to set the stage for his familiar pattern of isolating and crushing his opponents. However, critical miscommunications and the failure of Marshal Grouchy to effectively pursue Blücher after Ligny would prove disastrous. Blücher, though defeated, managed to retreat in good order, promising Wellington his support. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation at Waterloo, a small village south of Brussels. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced Wellington's army, strategically positioned on a ridge, with the farmhouses of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte forming crucial strongpoints. The battle began with a French assault on Hougoumont, a fierce, prolonged struggle that drew in significant French reserves. Wellington, a master of defensive warfare, held his ground with steadfast determination, his troops forming squares to repel repeated French cavalry charges. The British squares, though battered, did not break, a testament to their discipline and the Duke's leadership. As the day wore on, Napoleon, increasingly anxious about the non-appearance of Grouchy and the potential arrival of Blücher, pressed his attacks with growing desperation. He committed his cavalry in wave after wave, hoping to shatter Wellington's lines, but the British infantry, though exhausted, stood firm. The French artillery pounded the enemy positions, yet the defensive strength of the terrain and the resilience of the Allied troops proved formidable. The battle hung in a precarious balance, a brutal test of wills and endurance. Then, in the late afternoon, the first Prussian detachments, led by Blücher, began to appear on Napoleon's right flank, fundamentally altering the tactical situation. The sight of the Prussian banners emerging from the woods sent a ripple of alarm through the French ranks and a surge of renewed hope through the Allied lines. Napoleon, realizing his window of opportunity was rapidly closing, made his final, desperate move. He committed his elite Imperial Guard, the veterans who had served him for years, the men who had never before been repulsed. With Napoleon's brother, Jérôme, leading the charge, the Imperial Guard advanced up the slope, a formidable wall of seasoned soldiers, their reputation preceding them. But this time it was different. Wellington, sensing the decisive moment, ordered his hidden British guards to rise and deliver a devastating volley at close range. The French Imperial Guard, for the first time in their storied history, wavered, then broke. The cry, "La garde recule," echoed across the battlefield, a sound that signaled the end of an era. With the Imperial Guard in retreat and the Prussians now fully engaged, the French line crumbled. The meticulously planned battle had become a rout. Napoleon's final crushing defeat on the battlefield was complete. In the chaotic aftermath, Napoleon fled, abandoning his army. He returned to Paris, but the political landscape had irrevocably shifted. His support had evaporated, his allies had deserted him, and the legislative bodies demanded his abdication. On June 22, 1815, for the second and final time, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated his throne. He sought to escape to the United States, hoping to live out his days in quiet exile. However, the British, who now controlled the seas, had no intention of allowing such a dangerous and charismatic figure to remain free. He surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, believing he would be treated as a political exile. Instead, the British government, in concert with its allies, deemed him too great a threat to European peace. Their decision was to send him to the most remote, desolate island they could find, St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, over 1,800 kilometers from the nearest landmass. Napoleon arrived on St. Helena in October 1815, a prisoner of the British Crown. His final years were spent in bitter reflection, under constant surveillance by his British captors, most notably the strict and often antagonistic Governor Hudson Lowe. He resided at Longwood House, a damp, dilapidated residence, where his health gradually deteriorated. Surrounded by a small circle of loyalists, he spent his days dictating his memoirs, meticulously crafting his own legacy, portraying himself as a champion of revolutionary ideals, a martyr to the cause of liberty. He blamed his defeats on the treachery of his marshals and the elements, rarely acknowledging his own miscalculations. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, though theories of arsenic poisoning have persisted for centuries. His body was initially buried on the island, but in 1840, in a grand ceremony, his remains were returned to France and interred in Les Invalides in Paris, a final homecoming for the man who had shaped the destiny of a continent. Napoleon's life was a meteoric ascent and a dramatic fall, a testament to both extraordinary genius and tragic hubris. He conquered Europe and lost everything, yet his impact was indelible. The Napoleonic Code laid the foundation for modern European law, his administrative reforms reshaped France, and his wars redrew the map of Europe, igniting nationalism and challenging the old monarchical order. He was a paradox, a revolutionary emperor, a liberator who became a despot, a military genius whose ambition ultimately consumed him. His legacy remains a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy, a testament to the enduring power of one man's will to change the world, for better or for worse. The world he left behind was irrevocably altered, forever bearing the imprint of the man who dared to dream of an empire, and for a fleeting, glorious moment made it a reality.